On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the University of Notre Dame, I'd like to welcome you to our third annual Notre Dame Shakespeare Lecture in honor of Professor Stanley Wells. My name's Warren von Eschenbach, and I'm Assistant Provost for Europe and Director of the University of Notre Dame in England. We're delighted to have Professor Ann Thompson, Professor Emeritus of King's College London, here to deliver tonight's lecture, and to welcome you all to our building here in Westminster, which was once the site of the Oxford-Cambridge United Universities Club. If I may, I'd like to take just 2 minutes quickly for those of you who may not be that familiar with the university, just to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we're doing in Europe and London in particular. We're a leading Catholic research university located about 90 miles outside of Chicago in northern Indiana. And though our sporting teams go by the nickname the Fighting Irish, our roots are distinctly French. We were founded by French missionaries in 1842 of the Congregation of Holy Cross religious order, primarily to serve the educational needs of the local community, but quickly grew both in scope and ambition, and by the late 19th century had established the first Catholic law school and the first Catholic School of Engineering in the United States. Currently, we educate roughly 11,000 undergraduate and postgraduate students and have about 1,500 scholars, teachers, and researchers on our faculty. Notre Dame opened its first program in London in the 1970s for the law students, and about a decade later followed with the undergraduate program, which is unsurprisingly now our most popular study abroad destination for students. We educate more than 400 students in various programs here annually, both at the undergraduate and postgraduate level. In 2010, the university created an Office of Internationalization and appointed Professor Nick Encherkin as its first Vice President and Associate Provost to oversee this office. Part of our strategy and our charge is to develop comprehensive strategies to enhance the international experience of our undergraduate students, but also to expand the global reach of our faculty's research and scholarship. As part of these efforts, we're developing the sites that we have in Dublin, here in London, and then we have a new building in Rome into what we're calling global gateways, which are essentially venues for cultural and intellectual exchange, where we hope to bring a little bit of Notre Dame to the world and the world to Notre Dame. And though academic programs will remain a core part of these sites, our goal is to develop more opportunities for exchange with scholars and colleagues from around the globe through conferences and events such as the lecture here tonight. So we're really delighted, again, to have Professor Thompson here deliver this lecture and to see all you here. Finally, on behalf of the university, I just want to express our appreciation and gratitude to the co-sponsors of this event, again, for co-sponsoring with us for the third year, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust and the Shakespeare Institute, and again, to Professor Stanley Wells, who's here with us tonight, and to Ann Thompson for being our speaker. So finally, I'll ask the co-organizer of this event, Boyka Sokolova, to come and introduce our speaker. Thank you again for being here, and I look forward to seeing you at the reception.
It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to Trafalgar Hall and to this year's edition of the annual Notre Dame Shakespeare Lecture. As the ethos of the lecture requires, each year we invite speakers from different spheres of study and practice related to Shakespeare. Last year, our speaker was the director of the National Theatre, Sir Nicholas Heitner. This year, our speaker is an academic, whom I'm delighted to be able to introduce, Professor Ann Thompson, who in a way needs no introduction. As I look at the audience, there are so many faces of people who have worked with Anne as colleagues, co-authors, and students. But still, I have to say a few words. Anne is one of the most distinguished Shakespeareans of British academe. She has taught, lectured, and given papers all across the world, from Austin, Texas to Ankara, Turkey, Japan, Bulgaria, Hawaii, Poland, Spain, Taiwan. In her long career, she has shouldered masses of administrative duties. Among them, she has served as a head of department at Roehampton University and been head of department and dean at King's College London, from where she has just recently retired. At King's, she also became the founding director of their very successful Shakespeare Centre. For many years, Anne has steered the London Shakespeare Seminar, a major academic forum for Shakespeareans from all over the world and a place of intellectual exchange and debate. Alone and in collaboration, she has written and edited more than a dozen books, while her numerous papers grace some of the most prestigious journals and collections published in the field. Anne's work has shaped or visibly influenced several areas of research. As a feminist scholar actively working since the 1980s, she was among the first to set up courses on women's writers and feminist theory, as she did as a young lecturer at the University of Liverpool. This particular theoretical and scholarly interest has colored her entire career and the Shakespeare-related areas of her research. She has been a seminal presence in uncovering women's contributions to the study of Shakespeare. Women Reading Shakespeare, 1600 to 1900, written with Sasha Roberts, revealed the multiplicity and richness of women's voices informing our view of the national poet. Her essay, Miranda, Where is Your Sister? A feminist reading of The Tempest, is one of the often reprinted pieces of feminist criticism. The extent of Anne's influence on the field can be gauged by leafing through the recently published volume called Women Making Shakespeare. There you will find a large number of fairly short articles. Why so many and so short? The answer is very simple, because this was the Festschrift for Ann Thompson, and so many people were clamoring to be part of it. Thanks to the scope of her work, the section on Shakespearean criticism in, say, the Arden edition of the complete works now clearly states that the person who inaugurated the tradition of critical writing about Shakespeare was a woman. Another important field where Anne has applied her considerable powers is that of the study of Shakespeare's language and style. Together with John Thomson, she wrote Shakespeare, Meaning and Metaphor, and a number of important essays on imagery in Macbeth, the syntax of metaphor in Cymbeline, and metonymy in Hamlet. She is also co-editor of an Arden collection entitled Reading Shakespeare's Dramatic Language, and has generally fostered interest in the subject. The third major field where Anne has shone is, of course, editing and textual studies. Along with numerous publications on specific problems, she has edited The Taming of the Shrew for the New Cambridge series and is currently one of the general editors of the third series of Arden Shakespeare. She, as many in this room can testify, has enabled a raft of women to enter the editorial field. In 2006, together with Neil Taylor, she produced the impressive three-text edition of Hamlet, a real monument of modern editing with clear, comprehensive notes and introductions, which is a real joy to use and teach from. It is not surprising that, having spent a lot of time with Hamlet, whose first female editor she also happens to be, Anne has chosen to speak about this play. The title of her talk is You Need Not Tell Us What Lord Hamlet Said. Have we heard it all? Few are as well positioned as Anne to be able to tell us what Lord Hamlet said, and we surely haven't heard it all and look forward to more from her. Anne.
Thank you for inviting me. I feel a little intimidated by being here after the first two lecturers, Stanley himself and Nicholas Heitner. but I will try to maintain the tradition. And I am going to talk about Hamlet. One of the greatest challenges I found in teaching Hamlet in recent years is trying to remember or recreate what it would be like to read the play for the first time. I sometimes fantasize about having an accident where I lose my memory and then I can get that sense of what it would be like to read Hamlet for the first time. As an editor, one becomes extremely familiar with the play one is working on. In the case of the Arden Hamlet, that meant becoming familiar with all three of the early texts, the so-called bad first quarter of 1603, as well as the two rather different so-called good texts, 1604-5, second quarter, 1623 folio. Neil Taylor and I spent 10 years working on our editions, and we got to know the texts very well indeed. That's not a particularly long time in Arden terms. Nobody edits an Arden in less than 5 years, apart from David Bevington. And Neil and I both had demanding day jobs as head of department or dean while we were doing this. Most performances of Hamlet are based on one of the two good texts, and it's easy for anyone with even a quite limited knowledge of the texts to tell from the very first scene which text the actors are using. If it's the second quarto, Horatio will have a 14-line speech between the two appearances of the ghost, in which he compares the situation in Denmark with that in the most high and palmy state of Rome, a little ere the mightiest Julius fell. You can pick out words like Rome and Julius, even if the actors are performing in a language you don't know. If the folio text is being used, this speech is missing, and the second appearance of the ghost follows quite quickly after the first. Editors will notice more subtle differences. Does Marcellus, in that scene, refer to such daily cost of brazen cannon, which is the second quarto reading, or such daily cast of brazen cannon, which is the folio reading? Later, does Hamlet tell Horatio that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, which is the second quarto, or does he say our philosophy, which is the folio? Neil and I got to the point where we could tell if an actor was using a second quarto semicolon or a folio full stop. You do get over that, I think. Of course, we thought we already knew Hamlet quite well before we embarked on editing it, or indeed editing them. What we knew was the version available in most editions up until the 1980s, which consisted of a mixture, or conflation, of the two good texts. We were not so familiar with the bad text, and we began by editing that version, which is half the length of the others, and in many ways very different. We did that partly as a deliberate way of defamiliarizing ourselves with the play. The first quarto is Hamlet, but not as we know it. We also worked from unannotated, unpunctuated versions of each of the three texts, editing them as if no one had ever edited them before. I always advise editors in the Arden series to proceed in this way, to go through a completely plain text, punctuating it and highlighting or underlining what they think needs a commentary note, regardless of what previous editors have done. Of course, one spends a lot of time reinventing the wheel, but it can be surprising how many fresh insights result. What I'm going to try to do now is to defamiliarize Hamlet in a different way. I'm going to take a very well-known scene, which contains probably the best-known speech in all of English drama, and I'm going to try to convince you that it's in fact very strange and raises a number of difficult questions that pervade the whole of what is in fact a deeply unsettling and problematic text. If we look at Act 3, Scene 1 of Hamlet, the to be or not to be scene, within the overall structure of the play, and try to forget for a moment how well we think we know it, we may discover a number of problems. There is, for example, the question of whether things that are said in this scene are consistent with things that are said elsewhere in the play. There is the question who actually hears what is said. There are questions relating to who is present on stage and who is seen by other characters to be present. There is a particular question about the presence of Ophelia and Hamlet's treatment of her. When we look at all three texts of the play, there is a question about whether to be or not to be actually belongs in this scene at all, and whether it is really a soliloquy. And for the editor, there are further questions arising from the differences between the three texts. You've got the scene on the handout. To begin with, what is odd about this scene in the so-called good texts, the second quarter and the folio, the texts with which we're mainly familiar? The scene begins somewhat informally in these texts. Despite the stage direction for the entry of the royal party and their followers, enter King, Queen, Polonius, Ophelia, Rosencrantz, Guildenstern and Lords, there is no stage direction saying flourish in the second quarto to indicate a fanfare of trumpets for the royal entry, as had happened at the beginning of the two previous court scenes, Act 1, Scene 2 and Act 2, Scene 2. The folio doesn't provide a stage direction of that kind for any of these scenes. Incidentally, the king is never named in the dialogue of any of the three texts, although the queen is frequently referred to as Gertrude or variants of that name. The king is called Claudius in the entry direction for Act 1, Scene 2, in both the second quarto and the folio, and in his first speech prefix in the second quarto, but nobody ever addresses him or refers to him by that name. He is just king. You sit through any of the three texts paying very close attention, you would never hear the name Claudius mentioned. In fact, in this scene, the characters enter in the midst of conversation, as they often do in plays of this period, with the king asking Rosencrantz and Guildenstern about their progress in investigating Hamlet. He says, "And can you by no drift of circumstance get from him why he puts on this confusion, grating so harshly all his days of quiet with turbulent and dangerous lunacy?" That's what you have on the handout, and it's from the version of Hamlet that appears in the Oxford Complete Works, chosen partly in honour of Stanley Wells, and also because I can get the whole scene onto 2 pages, which you can't do with the Arden. Circumstance in the first line is the folio reading. The second quarto reads conference. Some editors see circumstance as an authorial second thought. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern then deliver their report. It is a disingenuous one, with Rosencrantz, often played here as rather smug, claiming that Hamlet received them well and was niggard of question, but of our demands most free in his reply. This seemed such an inaccurate description of the actual encounter staged in the previous scene that one 18th century editor, William Warburton, in 1747, advocated amending by reversing the terms to read most free of question, but of our demands, niggard in his reply. In Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz concurred with this, saying 27 questions he got out in 10 minutes and answered 3. Rosencrantz mentions the arrival of the players and Hamlet's interest in them, including his invitation to the king and queen to see the play, after which the king dismisses everyone, saying, "For we have closely sent for Hamlet hither, that he, as 'twere by accident, may here affront Ophelia." When Hamlet actually arrives, however, at line 57, he gives no verbal indication that he is responding to a message from the king, although some performers, especially those who have followed John Dover Wilson's stage directions for Hamlet to make an early entry in the previous scene so that he overhears the king and Polonius plotting against him, some actors make a show of looking around carefully for someone else at this point. Dover Wilson thought that Hamlet had to overhear the king and Polonius plotting in order to explain his cruel treatment of Ophelia later in this scene. Hamlet's entry is preceded by a brief conversation between the Queen and Ophelia, in which Gertrude expresses the wish that Ophelia's virtues may restore Hamlet to his wonted way again. Apparently, the Queen has none of the objections to a match between the two of them that Polonius and Laertes assumed there would be in their advice to Ophelia back in Act 1, Scene 3. Next, the king makes his first direct confession of guilt, but only aside to the audience and only in very general terms, as he responds to Polonius' comment on the hypocrisy of setting Ophelia up with a prayer book. The king says, "How smart a lash that speech doth give my conscience. The harlot's cheek, beautied with plastering art, is not more ugly to the thing that helps it. It is my deed to my most painted word." This confession has been frequently omitted in performance since at least 1676. It's omitted incidentally in the touring version of Hamlet that the Globe are taking around the world from next month for the next 2 years. People omit it presumably on the grounds that it is better for the audience to continue to share Hamlet's uncertainty. The folio text has a stage direction exeunt after Polonius saying, "I hear him coming, let's withdraw, my lord," at line 57. Both the second quarto and the folio have a re-entry, "Enter King and Polonius," later at line 165. But these directions are misleading, since it is clear that the two characters remain present, within earshot of Hamlet, but initially at least unseen by him. Having overheard To Be or Not to Be and Hamlet's dialogue with Ophelia, the king rejects love as a motive for his behaviour and resolves to send the prince to England, while Polonius suggests an opportunity for further eavesdropping if the queen will invite Hamlet to see her after the play. Ophelia's very presence is another awkward element in this scene. She is obviously on stage and has been specifically set up to encounter Hamlet, but usually he does not see her until line 90, when he says, "Soft you now, the fair Ophelia." And he usually delivers his famous speech, To Be or Not to Be, as if he is alone. A few 20th century performers of the role, for example, Derek Jacobi, directed by Tony Robertson at London's Old Vic in 1977, and Jonathan Pryce, directed by Richard Eyre at London's Royal Court in 1980, aroused controversy by addressing the speech directly to Ophelia, but this is uncommon. There is also a problem about what Ophelia hears and what she knows. Actresses and their directors have often been concerned to excuse her from complicity in the plot against Hamlet, but this goes against the lines directly spoken to her by both Gertrude and Polonius in the first part of the scene. The confrontation with Hamlet in this scene is in fact their first encounter on stage in the play, unless Ophelia has been a silent presence in Act 1, Scene 2, the first big court scene, as perhaps is indicated by the folio stage direction, which includes her in the general entry of the court at the beginning of that scene. Even though she has no lines in Act 1, Scene 2, she is often present in productions and films which invent some business to establish her relationship with Hamlet. She doesn't usually appear in editions because she has no lines, so editors leave her out. In Act 3, Scene 1, she is given an exit in some copies of the second quarto, but not in other copies and not in the folio, when the king and Polonius re-enter at line 165. But this is probably a mistake, because Polonius addresses her directly soon afterwards, saying, "How now, Ophelia? You need not tell us what Lord Hamlet said. We heard it all." It's not clear why she should need to be told this, since she was clearly aware that they would be eavesdropping. In performance, that speech by Polonius can be made to express kindness. He spares Ophelia the pain of having to repeat her experience. Or it can be made to express cruelty. He dismisses her and her pain without further thought. In stage tradition, since at least 1676, Ophelia has frequently left the scene at line 165, with the subsequent lines addressed to her being cut. The alternative from at least 1723 was for her to leave at line 165 and then return as if summoned by "How now, Ophelia?" at 181. If she remains on stage, she is often out of earshot of the king's speech from 165, in which she rejects love as the explanation for Hamlet's behaviour and determines to send him to England. And she is out of earshot for Polonius' reply, in which she proposes further eavesdropping in the Queen's closet after the play. Oxbury's 1827 acting edition says she goes up the stage. Sometimes she is present, but just too distressed to listen to these speeches. The encounter between Hamlet and Ophelia is, of course, a painful one. editors as well as directors have struggled to motivate Hamlet's cruel treatment of her, usually by indicating that he is aware of her complicity in the plot against him. If he is not aware of it from the beginning of the dialogue, he sometimes seems to see or hear the spies at line 132, whereupon he asks Ophelia, "Where's your father?" He is either lying or confused when he says, "I never gave you aught," at line 98, perhaps because he is hurt by her refusal to see him and her attempt to return his gifts. His attack on her honesty and on women in general for, amongst other things, their use of makeup, is a conventional piece of early modern misogyny. But his command to get thee to a nunnery, repeated 5 times in the second quarto and the folio, 8 times in the first quarto, seems intended to protect her and prevent her from breeding more sinners, though some editors still note the apparently irrelevant slang sense of nunnery as brothel. Her responses at line 136, "Oh, help him, you sweet heavens," and at line 144, "Oh, heavenly powers, restore him," indicate that she assumes he has genuinely gone mad, as does her lament at line 153, beginning, "Oh, what a noble mind is here o'erthrown." In general, she evinces sympathy and generosity towards him, making his behaviour all the more puzzling, and audiences may find disagreeable, even if it is presented as an agonised response to what he sees as her treachery. So what about this scene in the first quarto? In the first text of Hamlet to be published, the so-called bad quarto, 1603, this scene, which is scene 8 in the Arden edition, which just numbers scenes, not acts, the scene runs to just 40 lines, compared with around 190 lines in the second quarto and the folio. It contains merely the first element of Act 3, Scene 1 in the other texts, the report of Gilderstone and Rosencraft, as they're called in the first quarto, and the last element, the proposal of Carambis, as Polonius is called in this text, for further eavesdropping. This is not because Hamlet's soliloquy and his confrontation with Ophelia have been omitted from the text, but because they have appeared at an earlier point, in fact in the previous scene. Scene 7 in the first quarto, the equivalent of Act 2, Scene 2 in the longer texts. Immediately after Polonius, or Carambis, has suggested the first eavesdropping. He puts it to the king thus, in Act 2, Scene 2, in second quarto and folio, "You know he sometimes walks 4 hours together here in the lobby. At such a time I'll loose my daughter to him. Be you and I behind an arras then." This corresponds in the first quarto to the lines, "The prince's walk is here in the gallery. There let Ophelia walk until he comes. Yourself and I will stand close in the study." In all 3 texts, Hamlet enters reading at this point. But look where sadly the poor wretch comes reading, as the Queen puts it, in the second quarto and folio, and see where he comes poring upon a book, as the King puts it in the first quarto. What is different is that in the first quarto, the King and Polonius immediately put their plan into effect, dismissing the Queen and setting up Ophelia with her book. The King's brief confession of guilt does not appear in the first quarto, but To Be or Not to Be and Hamlet's encounter with Ophelia duly follow. Thus the first quarto further complicates the question of Ophelia's presence in this scene. She has in fact been present from earlier in this scene in the first quarto, as one might have expected from her father's response to her revelations about Hamlet's visit to her in her closet at the end of the previous scene in all 3 texts, in which, at the end of Act 2, Scene 1 that is, in which Carambis says to her, "Let's to the king," and Polonius says twice, "Come go with me, I will go seek the king," and "Come go we to the king." It seems natural in the first quarto that she should enter with her father when he announces the return of the ambassadors, and for her to be present, albeit silent, while he speaks of Hamlet's love for her. But Polonius enters alone in the second quarto and the folio. Again, some productions and films have, probably unknowingly, followed the first quarto here, and Ophelia had Ophelia on stage, even going further by having her read out Hamlet's letter to her herself. She did this in Kenneth Branagh's film in 1996 and in Michael Almereyda's film in 2000. Next question, is to be or not to be in the wrong place? Several scholars have commented on what they see as the awkwardness of having two characters reading books on stage at the same time. I don't know why, it happens in my household all the time. But they've used this as part of their argument that the first quarto has mistakenly displaced this sequence. But there is a strong theatrical tradition of preferring the first quarto ordering of events. British examples in the 20th century of preferring the placing of to be or not to be where it is in the first quarto, back in Act 2, Scene 2, include Michael Benthall directing John Neville at the Old Vic in 1957, Tony Richardson directing Nicol Williamson at the Roundhouse in 1969, Ron Daniels directing Mark Rylance for the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford in 1989, Matthew Walkes directing Alec Jennings for the Royal Shakespeare Company in 1997. Further examples in the present century include Trevor Nunn directing Ben Whishaw at the Old Vic, and Michael Boyd directing Toby Stevens for the RSC, both in 2004, and Gregory Doran directing David Tennant for the RSC in 2008. Indeed, when I reviewed the production directed by Michael Grandage, starring Jude Law, at the Donmar West End season in London's Wyndham's Theatre in 2009, I felt obliged to note that to be or not to be was given in the second quarto folio position. So frequently has it been relocated. Why does this happen, given that the first quarto has never been accorded much textual authority, being generally regarded as a memorial or reported text put together by memory by actors or audience members without access to a written script? Fortunately, recent directors are quite likely to explain choices of this kind. In a programme essay called, significantly I think, Director's Cut, for the 2004 Old Vic production, the author, Elaine Peake, writes that Trevor Nunn even goes to the notorious bad quarto for alternatives which he feels will work. After giving a single example of a substitution of an easier phrase, substituting more than other people for more than their even Kristen in the graveyard scene, she continues, Nunn is also very conscious of the fact that in this production he is contributing to an ongoing debate as to where the most famous speech in the English language should come in the play. Hamlet's soliloquy, to be or not to be, traditionally appears in a place which is difficult to justify in terms of either the character or the narrative itself. Throughout the play, Shakespeare seems to be providing his tragic hero with soliloquies at regular and measured intervals, but this speech comes only a few lines after the previous soliloquy, "Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I." At the end of that one, Hamlet has a positive plan of campaign. The play's the thing, wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. He is patently intent on action here. Then, only 50 or so lines later, he is discussing whether or not he should take his own life. This is an uncomfortable development. This essay also worries about the presence of other characters in the scene. Elaine Peake goes on, there is also the fact that on all other occasions when Hamlet is speaking his thoughts directly to the audience, Shakespeare has taken great pains to ensure he is alone, and frequently indicates this in the text. In the case of To Be or Not to Be in its usual printed position, not only is Ophelia on stage, where she has been instructed to stay and be discovered by Hamlet, we're also told very clearly that both Polonius and Claudius are overhearing what is going on. It is almost impossible for a director to communicate to an audience that Hamlet is speaking his thoughts out loud and that the other three people on stage cannot hear him. So Nunn has taken the controversial decision to move the soliloquy. It's not quite explicit in the way it's expressed here that Nunn's controversial decision is inspired by the first quarto. Perhaps because, while the earlier placing of the speech comes from that text, the problem of on-stage auditors exists in the first quarto as well as in the later texts. Gregory Doran was more explicit in one of his notes, headed A Rehearsal Scrapbook, in the programme to his 2008 Royal Shakespeare Company production. Doran writes, "Working through Act 3, we reach the most famous soliloquy of all, to be or not to be. Why is it here? Why, after Hamlet has found such inspiration in the player's tears at Hecuba, when he has decided to catch the conscience of the king with the mousetrap, has he descended into this slough of despondency and fatalism? A solution presents itself. In the first quarto, the speech appears in Act 2, and is the first time we see Hamlet following the encounter with his father's spirit, and since Ophelia's description of the distracted prince's appearance in her closet, we try adopting this structure." I find it interesting that neither director indicates that this decision has ever been made before. They both seem to assume that they are the first directors to have made this decision. Sorry. It is perhaps disconcerting to find that this, the most famous soliloquy of all, the most famous speech in the English language, first of all, is not, strictly speaking, a soliloquy in any of the three texts, and secondly, that it is portable or detachable, easily moved to one scene some 500 lines earlier, if the director finds its traditional position in the two so-called good texts uncomfortable. Most people in most audiences would probably not notice any difference. In the days when Hamlet was performed with 2 or even more intervals, a break between Act 2 and Act 3 could lessen the apparent abruptness of Hamlet's change of mood, simply by suggesting that more time has passed. But in current practice in the theatre, you usually get just one interval, which comes later than this. Next question, how do editors tackle this famous speech? Unlike directors, editors of modern scholarly editions cannot simply move speeches around. Throughout the 18th, 19th, and most of the 20th centuries, editorial tradition was to combine or conflate the two good texts of Hamlet and to provide the longest text possible by including all the passages that are found only in the second quarto, as well as all the passages that are found only in the folio. Since the 1980s, some editors who believe that the folio text derives from an authorial revision of the play have accordingly based their texts on it and printed the second quarto only passages in square brackets. Philip Edwards does that in the New Cambridge edition, or relegating them to an appendix, as Stanley Wells and his co-editors do in the Oxford Complete Works, and as George Hibbard does in the Oxford one-volume edition. No one, apart from those specifically editing the first quarto, has adopted the earlier placing of to be or not to be. As this speech is the most famous in the play, its first line is the first quarto's most famous variant from the other texts, reading as it does, "To be or not to be, aye, there's the point." It seems extraordinary from a later perspective that if the first quarto is indeed some kind of memorial reconstruction, this line should have been misremembered. Though Shakespeare does use the phrase, "Aye, there's the point," in The Merry Wives of Windsor and in Othello, and he uses "there's the point" in Part 2 of Henry IV and in Antony and Cleopatra. So the expression itself is not un-Shakespearean, as some critics have said. In general, the first quarto's version of this speech is, like the rest of the text, a sort of rough and somewhat abbreviated version of what we find in the longer texts, though with two notable differences. The first is in Hamlet's representation of the afterlife. This is on the handout at the end, where Hamlet in the first quarto speaks of the undiscovered country at whose sight the happy smile and the accursed damned. But for this, the joyful hope of this, who'd bear the scorns and flatteries of the world. Sense requires us to understand the accursed are damned. The words happy smile and joyful hope are not present in the longer text, where the speech is rather darker. The second difference occurs as Hamlet goes on. Scorned by the right rich, the rich cursed of the poor, the widow being oppressed, the orphan wronged, the taste of hunger or a tyrant's reign, and 1,000 more calamities besides. The list is a commonplace one, but the mention of the widow and the orphan gives the speech a more specific and material social context, perhaps one more relevant to the actors and their audience than to the privileged prince. Actually, translators and performers, without reference to the first quarto, but perhaps with the same instinct, sometimes substitute their own topical references at this point in the speech, as in Boris Pasternak's early version, which included complaints about red tape, foul-mouthed petty officials, and the kicks of the worthless kicking the worthy. Turning to the more familiar versions of the speech in the longer texts, it may come as a surprise that after so much debate, editors and critics still disagree as to whether the question for Hamlet is A, whether life in general is worth living, B, whether he should take his own life, or C, whether he should kill the king. One reason for this uncertainty is that the speech is cast in very general terms. Hamlet's use of we is not the personal royal we standing in for I, but a kind of generalizing we standing for we human beings. He does not discuss the specific nature of his own problems at this point in the narrative at all. And one of the most remarkable examples of how portable or detachable this speech is, in one modern production directed by Peter Brook at the Bouffe du Nord in Paris in 2000, subsequently on tour in London and New York in 2001, Adrian Lester spoke to Be or Not to Be, not in its first quarto position in Act 2, nor in its second quarto folio position in Act 3, but towards the end of Act 4, where it replaced Hamlet's last soliloquy, how all occasions do inform against me. This speech, which is absent from both the first quarto and the folio, comes after Hamlet has killed Polonius and is being escorted into exile. So it is his lowest point, and thus the appropriate place for to be or not to be, according to Brook. I got very excited when I went to that production, having avoided reading the reviews, and I thought, they've not got to be or not to be in Act 2, they've not got it in Act 3, perhaps they're going to leave it out altogether. I thought this is really radical, but no. No, it cropped up at the end of Act 4. And I don't think most people noticed. Most people thought this was perfectly normal. It fitted fine into the narrative at that point. Neil and I didn't, as editors of the Arden edition, feel it was our job to decide what the question is that Hamlet is talking about here, or to tell our readers how to interpret this speech, or indeed the play more generally. We felt instead that we should give them the information they needed to make up their own minds about the speech, and to understand why editors and critics continue to disagree about it, as they do about so many other aspects of the play. In our textual notes, we indicated variant readings, editorial emendations. In our commentary notes, we referred readers to other parts of our edition, where some aspects of the speech were discussed in more detail. It was a requirement of the Arden series for which we were working that we began by modernising the spelling and punctuation of the speech. We also followed standard practice in glossing obsolete or unfamiliar words, contumely at line 73, fardels at 78, born at 81. We noted proverbial phrases, a sea of troubles at 61. We explained metaphors, rob from bowls at 67. Quietus from finance at 77. And occasionally we clarified the syntax, as when we paraphrased the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, line 75, as the rejections of setbacks that a patient and deserving person receives from worthless or despicable people. We commented on staging options, what might happen on stage, or what has happened in specific productions. We addressed some of the queries that readers, including actors, might have about the speech. Why, for example, does Hamlet claim that no traveller returns from death, given that he has recently met his father's ghost? What does he mean by his use of the word conscience in line 85? Just a few examples of variant readings to finish with, really. If we'd been editing a single text of Hamlet, we might have been tempted to be eclectic, taking readings from both the second quarto and the folio. But since we had the luxury of editing each text separately, we decided to retain readings in cases where they seemed to us to make sense without too much strain. Another way of putting it would be to say that we did not amend the text if we would not have done so had only one text of the play survived. Because there are two good texts of this play, editors whose work is ostensibly based on one text are often tempted to take a reading they personally prefer from the other texts, even when it is not strictly necessary to do so. You would think, from the average number of emendations of Hamlet in texts based on either the second quarto or the folio, that both these texts were liberally sprinkled with scribal or compositorial errors, as compared with single text plays like Macbeth or Antony and Cleopatra, but this is not the case. To give just a couple of examples from this speech, in our text of the folio, we retained its reading, "The Poor Man's Contumely," at line 73, where some editors who consider the folio to be an authorial revision nevertheless amend to the second quarto reading, "The Proud Man's Contumely." It seemed to us that the folio reading could either indicate that Hamlet, as a prince, might have been irritated by the insolence of his social inferiors, or that the phrase might refer to the insolent treatment suffered by the poor man. Conversely, in the next line, in our text of the second quarto, we retained its phrase, "The pangs of despised love," where some editors who are generally faithful to the quarto prefer the folio reading, "The pangs of disprized love." Both readings seemed to us to make acceptable sense. We didn't see any reason to change one to the other. Later in the speech, Hamlet in the second quarto talks of how enterprises of great pitch and moment with disregard their current turn awry, whereas in the folio he talks about enterprises of great pith and moment with disregard their current turn away. Both pitch and pith and away awry seem to make sense as they stand, though again editors often choose to amend, usually preferring the second quarto's pitch and awry as the more unusual words, likely to be replaced with more common ones by a careless scribe or compositor. There was in fact only one instance in this speech where he amended the second quarto text with a word from the folio, namely at line 86, where Hamlet says in the folio that the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought. This seemed to us to make sense, where the second quarto's sickled o'er did not. We could find no other instance to enable us to claim that sickled could simply be a variant spelling of sicklied. This is arguably an emendation we might have made even if the folio had not existed. We didn't amend the folio version of this speech at all, though earlier in the scene we amended its reading of Polonius' expression surge o'er in line 50 to sugar o'er, which is the second quarto reading. But again, it's a correction we might have made even if the second quarto had not existed. In conclusion, there is nothing straightforward about Hamlet. This is perhaps part of the fascination it has held for over 400 years. It may be that editors and directors are wrong to try and tidy it up when they find it uncomfortable, by correcting apparent contradictions, moving parts of the text around, introducing stage business and stage directions, or in the case of editors, commentary notes, to explain the motivation and behaviour of the characters, who are actually behaving very strangely in this scene. Hamlet himself might scold us for attempting to pluck out the heart of my mystery, as he scolds Guildenstern in the next scene. One of his mysteries is his attitude to his own death, a matter which preoccupies him from his very first soliloquy, in which he certainly contemplates self-slaughter, on to his final philosophical acceptance that the readiness is all before his final duel with Laertes. Another of Hamlet's mysteries is his attitude to women, of course, specifically Gertrude and Ophelia, and the extent to which his behaviour is motivated by this. Both of these topics are crucially important in this scene, and the manner in which they are interpreted here will build on what has gone before and point forward to what follows. The presence of spies or eavesdroppers, problematic as it is here, characterises the play and has led to whole productions and films, especially in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe under communist rule, being dominated by the idea, voiced explicitly by Hamlet only in the folio text, that Denmark's a prison. And the scene has more mundane work to do in forwarding the plot by reminding us what Rosencrantz and Guildenstern have been commissioned to do, confirming the forthcoming performance of the murder of Gonzago, and revealing the king's guilt and his plan to send Hamlet to England. And of course it ends with Polonius' fatal proposal to hide in the Queen's closet, as he does in Act 3, Scene 4. I think this scene epitomises the play as a whole, and the questions it raises pervade the entire text. Our familiarity with it can gloss over some of the difficulties, but every production and every edition has to grapple with them afresh. In short, I'm not at all confident that I can tell you what Lord Hamlet said, and I don't think we have heard it all. Thank you.
And thanks very much indeed. Really enjoyed the paper, thank you. I want to invoke a Notre Dame luminary who's not here this evening, our friend Peter Holland. It was Peter who said to me once, I'll never forget it, that the to be or not to be speech doesn't advance the plot of Hamlet one bit. And actually, it could be taken from the play entirely, and the play would almost be no poorer for it. To which I'd also add, the other problem with it is that it doesn't use ever at all the first person singular pronoun. So just two thoughts there about the speech in light of what you've been saying about it, and I wonder what you think to those 2 points.
Yes, they're both true, and I think that that argument comes up with the omission of Hamlet's last soliloquy in the first folio, How will occasions do inform against me, where editors who are arguing that the first folio text is Shakespeare's own revision argue that Shakespeare cut that speech precisely because it doesn't advance the plot. It simply repeats things we've heard before. Hamlet is in actually a very weak position at this point, and it's nonsense for him to say, I have will and strength and means to do it, when he's being escorted out of the country. But again, I suppose that if we left out of Shakespeare's plays everything that doesn't advance the plot, we wouldn't have much left. and Shakespeare's plays are not sort of fast-moving action blockbusters. They are plays in which people do repeat themselves, do kind of go around in circles and try to work out what they're doing. And perhaps Hamlet, more than anybody else, that yes, he has a lot of thoughts that are not relevant to his own situation. I mean, if he just got on with it, it would be over in the first scene. And I think that that's one of the problems about the kind of directorial and to some extent editorial desire to tidy it up, that if you tidy it up, you take away a lot of what we think is sort of fascinating and interesting about the play. Yes, yeah. Yes.
When I was teaching Shakespeare at all, I would often tell my students to look particularly at the passages that didn't advance the plot, because I think those things like the gardener scene in Richard II, or parts of the so-called over cliff scene in King Lear, for example, because I think those are the places where you get closest to what Shakespeare wanted us to know, wanted us to think about the play. So I think the fact that a scene or a speech is irrelevant to the plot is in its favour, in a sense. I think you're quite lucky, privileged in a sense, in being able to edit all 3 texts of the play. I think it was a very good idea to do that. And I wish that in the Oxford edition we had felt confident enough in the current editorial position confident enough to print both the quarto and the folio text of the play, which would have been relevant, not necessarily the bad quarto. As you know, when I edited King Lear for the Oxford multi-volume text, I did take the quarto text and edited that unusually and perhaps unfairly in some ways to the students who have to study the play. But in doing that, I went even further than the Oxford Complete Works would have done in preserving unpopular readings or odd readings, like Childe Roland's To the Dark Town Came, for example, is the reading of the quarter, which I preserved deliberately, trying to keep out of my mind the fact that there was another text of the play. So I think that's one of your advantages in having the ability, the brief to edit all three texts in that argument.
Yes, we were lucky, and we did want to include readings that have generally been rejected by the editorial consensus, but which would have been retained if there hadn't been another text to go to. So yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, well, in my experience, students differ. Some of my former students, bless them, are here tonight, but that some students think, oh God, we've got to read more than one text of this play, but others actually find it quite liberating that there is this monolith that is called Hamlet or that is called King Lear, and that they're told this is the greatest tragedy or whatever. But when you start talking about there being more than one version, and you say, well, which version is the greatest tragedy? And that it is possible for people, including students, to argue, is Hamlet better with to be or not to be 500 lines earlier? Is it better with or without the last soliloquy? If you were putting it on, would you cut that speech? Why would you cut it? Why would you retain it? So it can be quite liberating. Once they get over the sense that they don't want to read more than one play called Hamlet.
I can do without that. And you mentioned Dover Wilson, and I wonder about the history of editorial intervention in the 20th century. Does it become less prescriptive as we move from those mid-20th century editors to the present, or does the prescription become subtler, or can you comment on that?
I think Stanley can probably comment on that as well. I think editors are less sort of brazen about putting in stage directions in the way that Dover Wilson did. And publishers' conventions mean that we have to put things in square brackets, not that most readers notice that things are in square brackets when we're adding stage directions. I would say that probably we are less confident about dictating to readers what's going on. We're more able to say there is a problem here in the commentary notes, and not say by putting in a stage direction we have solved this. Stanley, you probably...
Well, yes, I agree. It's partly also to do with the fact that we're more conscious that these plays are plays to be staged, and that every time they're staged they're different. And so we certainly felt in editing of Oxford Shakespeare that we wanted to be far less prescriptive than most editors had been about stage action, while, in other words, to leave the options as open as possible when it was proper to do so, when it seemed proper to do so. Of course, you do need notes, explanatory notes often, and sadly we don't have them in that complete works as we wanted to. I think Dover Wilson is very exceptional, though, isn't he? I mean, he's grotesquely prescriptive and sometimes pictorial. The scent of roses scents the air in Midsummer Night's Dream. Sort of smelly feeling of producing the play in several dimensions.
Yes. Some editors I've encountered in my role as general editor of Arden, recently people have become very reluctant to have stage direction saying aside, which is often quite important, I think, for at least student readers to know that this speech cannot be heard by other people who are on stage, because the normal assumption would be that every speech can be heard by everybody on stage. But some editors have become very reluctant to put in aside, and they say it's all kind of optional. It should be up to the actors to decide whether it's aside or not. But it can make nonsense of some. I mean, if you don't have some of Iago's asides in Othello, the plot collapses rather quickly. But that's, I suppose, the trend which we refer to as unediting, where people are wanting there to be less and less interference by editors, so that readers have to do all the work for themselves. And in editing the 3 texts of Hamlet, people attacked us and said we weren't doing our job as editors, that our job was to decide which is the right text and which is the right reading, and that we shouldn't be giving these choices to readers. So,
well, for that you needed a fourth text, wouldn't you? But
yes.
the 4th text, here is what we think is really.
yes. Which I don't think we are capable of coming up with.
Who is your favourite? I know that's unfair. Or is that your 2 or 3 favourite Hamlets over a long time?
I've certainly lost count of how many productions I've seen. I tend to say that my favourite film of Hamlet is the 1920 Asta Nielsen, silent Hamlet with a woman playing Hamlet, which is a brilliant film and which is now available generally in 1920. It's just terrific. Recent productions, I really liked the 2 Gents version with 2 actors from Zimbabwe playing all the parts. That worked very well. I think I've seen a lot of very good Hamlets. So, Sam West was good. It's invidious. Adrian Lester was good, I thought, actually, despite some of the problems with that Peterbrook production. And you would want to kind of pick and mix. And I have come away from a Hamlet saying, that's the best Voltimand I've ever seen, which is perhaps not the highest praise. but you could pick, and it's sort of, I suppose it's what people do with their dream football team, that you bring in people from different teams and different times, and you produce your ideal football team. I could do an ideal Hamlet from across all times and countries.
It's interesting that the ones you seem to like best are the ones that diverge most from, one with no words at all, and others with very strong, very heavy textual adaptation. So you leave your editorial hat behind you when you get into the theatre.
Quite possibly, yes. Or perhaps I'm in that phase at the moment that you just know it so well that you want to escape from it occasionally. You want somebody to do something that will surprise you.
And explain the rich complexity surrounding even the best known soliloquy in the play. We should spare a thought then for the suffering of a translator to a language which doesn't have an infinitive.
Yes. Yes. I was at a meeting at the Globe yesterday, and up the staircase that you go to the Sackler Studios, they've got to be or not to be in a multitude of different languages, and some languages have difficulty translating that.
Let's thank Anne for the wonderful. In way of a coda, I would like to read the tribute which Peter Holland sent this morning from Notre Dame, a tribute to Anne, and a statement of what she means to us. I believe he expresses the attitude of many of the people in this room. Anne has been an always generous mentor and friend to so many, a critic admired by everyone, a scholar of the highest standards, a leader in so many ways of thinking about Shakespeare. And now she's retired. Can that really be possible? She will be writing even more to keep us all on our toes, making us always rethink what we thought we knew, sending us back to the play, reinvigorated by her profoundly perceptive, richly sympathetic analysis. I think that's really true for Anne. Thank you, Anne.